carriage wheels cracked against the frozen road, and Evelina Hart pressed her hand against her stomach, holding her breath until the sound of hooves faded into the dark. Behind her, the lights of Ashcombe Manor still glowed through the fog, warm and golden, as if nothing inside those walls had just been broken. She did not look back again. She could not afford to. If she looked back one more time, she knew her courage would crumble, and she would turn the carriage around and run straight into the arms of the man she loved, the man who did not yet know what she carried inside her. 3 hours earlier, Evelina had been standing in the drawing room of the Duchess, listening to words that still echoed in her ears like the ringing of a broken bell. The Duchess had not raised her voice. She never needed to. Her voice had been calm, almost gentle, as she explained to Evelina that a woman of her background could never be allowed to stand beside a duke. She had spoken of duty, of bloodlines, of the weight of centuries resting on her son's shoulders, a weight that a seamstress's daughter could never help him carry. She had offered Evelina money. She had offered her a new life far away, on the condition that she vanish before Julian returned from his trip to the northern estates. Evelina had wanted to refuse. She had wanted to stand her ground and wait for Julian, to let him decide his own future, instead of his mother deciding it for him. But then the Duchess had said one more thing, quietly, almost as an afterthought, and it had changed everything. She had said that if Evelina truly loved her son, she would not want to be the reason his family turned against him, the reason his tenants lost faith in him, the reason his name was dragged through scandal in every drawing room from London to Bath. She said love that causes ruin is not love at all. Evelina did not believe every word of that speech. She was not foolish. She understood manipulation when she heard it, but beneath the manipulation was a small, sharp truth she could not ignore. She had already seen how the older families looked at her when she walked beside Julian at the county fair. She had already heard the whispers behind fans and behind teacups, and now, with a child growing inside her, she was no longer only protecting herself. She was protecting a small life that had not yet taken its first breath, a life that deserved a chance at happiness, that did not begin in the shadow of hatred. So she packed a single trunk. She left behind the blue dress Julian had given her for her birthday, the one with tiny pearls sewn along the collar, because it felt like a promise she was breaking, simply by taking it with her. She left behind the letters he had written her during his weeks away, letters full of small jokes and quiet affection, because reading them again would have destroyed her resolve completely. She kept only one thing that belonged to him, a plain silver ring he had slipped onto her finger one evening beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the eastern meadow, half in jest, half in promise, saying that one day it would be replaced with something finer. She wore it now, hidden beneath a glove, as the carriage carried her away from everything she had built in the past year. The road to the coast was long, and Evelina spent much of it in silence, watching the moon rise and fall behind passing clouds. She thought of Julian's laugh, low and unguarded, the kind of laugh he never gave in front of his mother or his advisors. She thought of the way he used to trace the edge of her hand when he thought she was not paying attention, as if memorizing the shape of her fingers. She thought of the morning he had told her, half joking, that if they were ever separated, he would search every corner of England until he found her again. She had laughed then. She did not laugh now. Now those words felt less like a joke, and more like a warning she should have listened to more carefully. By the time the sun rose, Evelina had crossed into a county she barely knew, and she instructed the driver to stop at a modest inn, near the edge of a fishing town called Fernbridge. The town smelled of salt and burning wood, and gulls circled over the harbor with sharp, hungry cries. She stepped down from the carriage carefully, one hand resting against the small curve of her stomach, and looked out at the gray water stretching toward the horizon. It was nothing like the manicured gardens of Ashcombe. It was rougher, plainer, and somehow, that felt right. She did not deserve softness anymore. She had chosen this path with her eyes open, and now she had to walk it without looking back. She paid the driver the last of the coins the Duchess had given her, coins that felt heavier in her palm than any amount of money should, as though each one carried the weight of what she had given up to earn them. She watched the carriage turn back toward the road that led to Ashcombe, and for one long moment, she considered running after it, climbing back inside, and demanding to be taken home. But then she remembered the calm cruelty in the Duchess's eyes, the certainty that a child born to a seamstress and a duke would only ever be seen as a mistake to be hidden, not a life to be celebrated. She turned instead toward the town, toward the uncertain future waiting for her there, and began to walk. Fernbridge was not a place designed for a woman traveling alone, and Evelina felt the weight of curious eyes as she made her way down the narrow main street, searching for lodging that did not ask too many questions. She found a small room above a bakery, owned by a widow named Clara Bennett, a woman with flour permanently dusted across her apron, and a sharp but kind gaze that seemed to take in everything, without judging any of it. Clara did not ask why a well-spoken young woman had arrived in Fernbridge with only one trunk and no family name to speak of. She simply showed Evelina the narrow bed by the window, and told her the rent was due every Friday. No exceptions, no excuses. That first night, alone in the small room above the bakery, Evelina finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for the life she had left behind, for the man she loved but could not stay with, for the child who would grow up not knowing the truth of where it came from, unless Evelina chose, someday, to tell it. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach and whispered a promise into the darkness, a promise that no matter what happened, no matter how hard the road ahead became, her child would never feel unwanted. Whatever else she had lost that night, she still had that one certainty to hold on to, and she intended to hold on to it with everything she had. Miles away, at Ashcombe Manor, Julian returned from the northern estates 2 days later than expected, exhausted from travel, but eager to see Evelina again. He had spent the long ride home composing the words he wanted to say to her, words about the future, about finally standing up to his mother's objections once and for all, about making his intentions toward her known to the entire county, whether his family approved or not. He had even carried, tucked carefully inside his coat, a small velvet box containing a ring, far finer than the simple silver one he had given her beneath the oak tree. He arrived at the manor just as the sun was beginning to set, and he asked for Evelina before he had even removed his riding gloves. The servants exchanged uneasy glances, the kind of glances that made Julian's stomach tighten with a dread he could not yet name. It was his mother who finally told him, in that same calm, measured voice she used for everything, that the young woman had left. She said it as though reporting the weather, as though announcing that a shipment of cloth had failed to arrive on schedule. She did not say why. She did not say where. She simply said that Evelina had decided, on her own, that a life at Ashcombe was not one she wished to continue. Julian did not believe it, not at first. He searched the manor grounds himself, calling her name through the gardens and the stables, as though she might simply be hiding, waiting for him to find her the way he always seemed to find her in their games during quieter days. He questioned the servants one by one, and most of them looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes, unwilling to say more than they had been instructed to say. Only the youngest kitchen maid, a girl barely 16 years old, finally admitted through nervous tears that she had seen the Duchess speaking with Evelina in the drawing room the day before, and that Evelina had left in a carriage not long after, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. That single piece of information was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Julian's mind, a doubt that would grow over the following days into something far larger and far more painful. He confronted his mother directly, demanding to know what had been said in that drawing room, but the Duchess simply repeated her earlier claim, insisting that Evelina had made her own choice, and that a duke should not chase after a woman who clearly did not wish to be found. Julian wanted to believe his mother. She was, after all, the only parent he had left, the woman who had raised him alone after his father's early death, the woman whose approval he had spent his entire life trying to earn. But something in her tone felt wrong, too smooth, too rehearsed, like a performance meant to end a conversation rather than answer a question. For the first few weeks, Julian told himself that Evelina would return, that whatever had frightened her away would pass, and that she would come back to him once she had time to think. He kept her letters in the drawer of his writing desk, rereading them late at night when the manor grew quiet, searching for any clue he might have missed, any sign that she had been planning to leave. He found nothing. Every letter spoke of affection, of small hopes for the future, of plans they had made together for the coming spring. None of it matched the sudden, silent departure his mother described. The more he read, the more certain he became that something had happened that his mother was not telling him. By the second month, Julian's patience had worn thin, replaced by a quiet, simmering anger that he directed mostly at himself. He blamed himself for leaving for the northern estates in the first place, for not insisting that Evelina accompany him, despite the impropriety it might have caused among his peers. He blamed himself for not standing up to his mother sooner, for allowing months to pass without formally declaring his intentions toward Evelina in front of the entire county, the kind of declaration that would have made it impossible for anyone to send her away without his knowledge. He had been a coward, he told himself, hiding behind private affection instead of public commitment, and now he was paying the price for that cowardice, with the absence of the woman he loved. He began writing to acquaintances in other counties, describing Evelina without naming her directly, asking if anyone had seen a young woman matching her description arrive in their towns. Most replies came back empty, polite regrets with no useful information. But Julian did not stop. He hired a discreet investigator from London, a quiet, careful man named Robert Ellery, and instructed him to search every coastal town within 100 miles, starting with the smaller fishing villages where a woman seeking to disappear might reasonably choose to hide. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required patience Julian did not naturally possess, but he forced himself to wait, because the alternative, giving up entirely, was something he refused to accept. Back in Fernbridge, Evelina settled slowly into her new life. Though every day still carried an undercurrent of grief, she worked hard to hide from Clara and the other townspeople. She found steady work assisting an elderly seamstress named Mrs. Dobbins, whose eyesight was beginning to fail, and who needed a younger set of hands to manage the finer stitching her customers still demanded. The work was familiar to Evelina, comforting in its repetition, and it gave her something to focus on besides the ache that lived permanently beneath her ribs. She told Mrs. Dobbins and Clara only that she was a widow, recently arrived from a county to the north, seeking a quiet place to raise her child. Neither woman pressed her for further details, though Evelina sometimes caught Clara watching her with an expression that suggested she suspected there was more to the story than what she had been told. As the weeks turned into months, Evelina's condition became impossible to hide, and she braced herself for the judgment she assumed would follow. To her surprise, the women of Fernbridge, hardened by years of watching husbands and sons sail out to sea and sometimes never return, seemed far less concerned with the details of her past than the wealthier families near Ashcombe had been. They brought her small gifts, tiny knitted garments and jars of preserves, and offered advice about childbirth, with the blunt practicality of women who had faced it themselves more than once. For the first time since leaving Ashcombe, Evelina felt something close to belonging, even as the ring hidden beneath her glove reminded her every single day of the life and the love she had chosen to leave behind. Late one evening, sitting by the window of her small room above the bakery, Evelina took out the silver ring and turned it slowly between her fingers, watching the dull light catch its plain surface. She thought about writing to Julian, just once, just to tell him the truth of why she had left and what she now carried because of their love. She even took out a sheet of paper and dipped her pen, sitting for nearly an hour with the ink slowly drying on the tip, unable to find the words that would not sound either like an accusation against his mother or a plea for him to abandon everything he had ever known. In the end, she folded the blank paper away and told herself that someday, when the child was older, when the world felt safer, she would find the courage to write that letter. For now, survival had to come first, and survival meant staying hidden, no matter how much it cost her heart to do so. The investigator Julian hired reached the outer edges of the coastal counties by early winter, moving methodically from town to town, showing a small sketch of Evelina to innkeepers, shopkeepers, and dock workers who might have crossed paths with a woman traveling alone. Progress was slow, frustratingly slow, and more than once Julian considered abandoning the search entirely, convincing himself that perhaps his mother had been right after all, that perhaps Evelina truly had chosen to leave him behind. But every time that thought crept into his mind, he remembered the warmth in her eyes, the steady honesty of her voice, and he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that something was missing from the story he had been told. He was determined to find that missing piece, no matter how long it took or how far he had to search to uncover it. Winter arrived in Fernbridge with a sharpness that cut through even the thickest wool coats, and Evelina felt every gust of icy wind, as a reminder of how far she had traveled from the warm halls of Ashcombe Manor. Her time was drawing near, and Mrs. Dobbins insisted she stop working the long hours she had grown used to, instead sending her home each afternoon with instructions to rest and eat well. Clara, in turn, began sleeping with one ear listening for any sound from the room above the bakery, ready to fetch the midwife the moment Evelina called out. The two women, strangers only months before, had become something Evelina had not expected to find again, so soon after losing everything else. A small, fierce circle of people who cared whether she lived or struggled alone. The birth came on a night thick with fog rolling in from the harbor, the kind of fog that made the gulls fall silent and the fishing boats stay tied to the docks. Evelina labored for hours in the narrow room above the bakery, gripping Clara's hand so tightly that bruises bloomed across the older woman's knuckles by morning. The midwife, a stern but capable woman named Agnes Pryor, moved with brisk efficiency through the long night, murmuring encouragement between sharp instructions. When the child finally arrived, just as the first gray light was creeping over the water, the tiny room fell into a silence so complete that for one terrifying heartbeat, Evelina feared the worst. Then came the cry, thin and furious and unmistakably alive, and Evelina wept with a relief so total it left her shaking. She named him Henry, after no one in particular, simply because it was a name that felt solid and warm, a name that did not carry the weight of Ashcombe or the sharp edges of a title he would never claim. As she held him for the first time, counting his tiny fingers, tracing the soft curve of his cheek, she noticed immediately what she had feared and hoped for in equal measure. His eyes, even in those first newborn hours, held a shape and a color that were unmistakably Julian's, the same warm brown flecked with gold that she had fallen in love with beneath the old oak tree. Looking at her son felt like looking at a small, living piece of the life she had left behind, and she was not certain, in that first fragile moment, whether the resemblance brought her comfort or renewed grief. The early months of Henry's life passed in the exhausted, tender blur that every new mother knows, filled with sleepless nights and small triumphs, a first smile, a first grip of a tiny fist around her finger, the first time he settled peacefully against her chest and slept for hours without stirring. Clara doted on him as though he were her own grandchild, and Mrs. Dobbins kept a small basket of scrap fabric by her workbench, specifically for Henry to grasp and examine, while Evelina worked nearby. Fernbridge, rough and unpolished as it was, had become something Evelina had not expected when she first stepped off that carriage, a place that felt, against all odds, something like home. Still, there were nights when the past refused to stay buried. Evelina would wake in the darkness, certain for one disoriented moment that she was back in her old room at Ashcombe, listening for the sound of Julian's footsteps in the corridor. She would lie awake afterward, staring at the low ceiling of the room above the bakery, wondering whether he had searched for her at all, whether he had simply accepted his mother's version of events and moved on with his life, perhaps already courting some other young woman of proper standing, whom the Duchess found suitable. The thought brought a fresh ache each time it surfaced, sharper somehow than the grief of the departure itself, because it meant imagining a version of Julian who had let her go without question. As Henry grew from an infant into a small, curious boy, Evelina worked tirelessly to build a life sturdy enough to support them both. She had, by then, taken over much of Mrs. Dobbins's business, as the older woman's eyesight continued to fade until she could no longer thread a needle without assistance. Evelina's reputation as a skilled seamstress spread beyond Fernbridge into the neighboring villages, and soon she was receiving commissions from families she had never met, drawn by word of mouth about the quiet, capable widow who could turn plain fabric into something almost elegant. The income allowed her to move into a slightly larger set of rooms, still above the bakery but with a proper window seat, where Henry loved to sit and watch the boats come and go in the harbor. Henry, for his part, grew into a boy full of restless energy and endless questions, the kind of child who seemed determined to understand the mechanics of everything around him, from the way the tide pulled at the shoreline to the way Clara's bread rose in the oven. He had inherited his mother's steady patience, but also, unmistakably, a certain confidence in the way he carried himself, a natural ease around strangers that made him a favorite among the fishermen and dock workers who let him watch as they mended nets and sorted the day's catch. More than once, Evelina caught herself watching him laugh with the same unguarded openness she remembered from Julian, and each time, the resemblance struck her with a force that left her briefly breathless. She told Henry, when he grew old enough to ask, that his father had died before he was born, a fisherman lost at sea in a storm that had taken several other men from a town further up the coast. It was a story she had constructed carefully, one that explained the absence without inviting further questions, one that fit naturally into the world of Fernbridge where such losses were tragically common. Henry accepted the story without much suspicion, as children often do, though occasionally he would ask small, pointed questions that made Evelina's chest tighten with the effort of maintaining the careful fiction she had built to protect him. Word of the search for a missing young woman had, in the earliest years, occasionally drifted through the coastal towns, carried by traveling merchants, and the investigator Julian had hired, who continued his methodical work long after most people expected him to give up. Evelina heard whispers of a well-dressed stranger asking questions in towns not far from Fernbridge, showing a sketch of a young woman to shopkeepers and innkeepers, and each time the whispers reached her, she felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of terror and something dangerously close to hope. She took precautions during those periods, avoiding the market square during the busiest hours, keeping Henry close, and reminding Clara and Mrs. Dobbins, without fully explaining why, to say nothing if any stranger came asking after a woman of her description. The investigator, Robert Ellery, did in fact pass through a town only 2 villages away from Fernbridge during Henry's second year, close enough that Evelina spent nearly a week in a state of quiet dread, certain that discovery was only days away. But the trail went cold there, as it had gone cold so many times before, and Ellery eventually moved further along the coast, chasing rumors that led nowhere, exhausting Julian's patience and, eventually, a significant portion of the family's resources devoted to the search. Julian, for his part, refused to call off the effort entirely, though as the years passed, even he began to accept the painful possibility that Evelina might never be found, that she had perhaps left the country altogether, or worse, that something terrible had happened to her on the road. Years passed in this uneasy rhythm, Evelina building a steady, if quietly guarded life in Fernbridge, while the shadow of her past occasionally brushed close enough to remind her it had never truly disappeared. Henry grew taller, more thoughtful, developing a habit of sketching the boats in the harbor with a surprising natural skill that delighted Clara and puzzled Evelina, who had no artistic talent of her own, to explain where the gift had come from. She watched him grow with a fierce, protective pride, grateful every single day for the life she had managed to build despite everything that had been taken from her, even as a small, persistent part of her heart remained tethered to the man she had left behind without explanation. It was in Henry's 7th year that the quiet rhythm of Fernbridge began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. A new shipping route had been established along the coast, bringing wealthier travelers and merchants through the town more frequently than ever before, men and women whose fine clothing and careful manners stood out sharply against the practical roughness of the fishing community. Evelina found herself taking on commissions from these travelers as well, drawn by the reputation she had built, and though the extra income was welcome, she could not shake a growing unease every time a new carriage rolled into town. Fernbridge, once a place remote enough to disappear into completely, was slowly becoming visible to the wider world, and visibility, Evelina knew better than anyone, was the one thing she could not afford. She began, quietly, to consider whether it might be time to move further along the coast, to a town even smaller, and even less connected to the routes that wealthy travelers now favored. She raised the idea gently with Clara one evening, only to find the older woman's eyes filling with tears at the mere suggestion of losing the family she had come to consider her own. Henry, when he overheard part of the conversation, protested loudly, insisting he did not want to leave the harbor, the boats, or the small collection of friends he had made among the other children of the town. Evelina, torn between caution and the desire to give her son a stable, unbroken childhood, ultimately decided to stay, telling herself that perhaps she was allowing old fears to outweigh the genuine safety she had built over so many careful years. That decision, made in a moment of exhausted hope rather than clear calculation, would prove to be the turning point that set the remaining course of her story into motion, though Evelina had no way of knowing it at the time. She simply continued her work, raised her son with quiet devotion, and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to believe that perhaps the past truly had been left behind for good. It was a belief she clung to through the following spring and summer, watching Henry grow more confident and curious with each passing month, never suspecting that not far away, a discovery was about to be made that would unravel every careful precaution she had built around their small, hidden life. Meanwhile, at Ashcombe Manor, Julian had changed in ways that even his closest friends found difficult to fully understand. The bright, easy warmth that had once defined him had been replaced by a quieter, more deliberate version of himself. A man who fulfilled his duties as Duke with careful competence, but who rarely allowed himself the kind of open joy that had once come so naturally. He had, over the years, resisted every attempt his mother made to introduce him to suitable young women from proper families, offering polite but firm refusals that eventually discouraged even her persistent efforts. He told himself, and occasionally told his closest friends, that he had simply grown too busy with the responsibilities of the estate to consider marriage, though those who knew him best suspected the truth ran deeper, rooted in a wound that had never properly healed. It was a chance conversation at a horse auction, of all places, that finally set Julian's search back into motion after nearly 2 years of reluctant stillness. A merchant from the coastal counties, making idle conversation while examining a promising young stallion, mentioned in passing a talented seamstress in a small fishing town who had built quite a reputation for her fine needlework. A widow, he believed, raising a son on her own. The merchant meant nothing significant by the remark, simply filling silence with local gossip, but something in the casual description struck Julian with an intensity he could not immediately explain. He found himself asking careful, measured questions, learning the name of the town, the rough direction along the coast, the approximate years the woman had lived there. That night, unable to sleep, Julian retrieved the small velvet box he had kept hidden in the back of his writing desk for nearly 7 years. The ring he had once intended to give Evelina, its polish long since dulled by disuse. He turned it over in his hands, remembering the exact words he had planned to say to her that evening so long ago, words he had never gotten the chance to speak. He thought of the child the merchant had mentioned, a boy raised alone by a widowed seamstress, and though logic told him it was almost certainly coincidence, almost certainly nothing more than a common story repeated in 100 small towns across the country, a deeper instinct refused to let the thought go quietly. By morning, he had made his decision. He would travel to that coastal town himself, not send an investigator this time, but go in person, one final time, to see for himself whether the trail had finally, after all these years, led somewhere real. The journey to the coast took Julian 3 days, longer than he had expected, as autumn rains turned the country roads into stretches of thick, clinging mud that slowed his carriage at every turn. He traveled with only a single manservant, Thomas Ainsley, choosing deliberately to leave behind the trappings of his title, the crest on the carriage door covered, his fine coats exchanged for plainer traveling clothes. He did not want word of a duke's arrival to reach the coastal counties ahead of him, did not want anyone to have time to prepare a story, or, worse, to warn the seamstress the merchant had mentioned that a stranger was coming to ask questions about her past. He spent much of the journey turning the small silver details of the merchant's story over in his mind, searching for reasons to dismiss the growing certainty building in his chest. A widow raising a son alone was hardly an unusual story along a coast that claimed so many fishermen's lives each winter. There was no reason to believe this particular woman was Evelina, no reason beyond a stubborn, aching hope that Julian had never quite managed to extinguish, despite years of failed searching. Yet the closer his carriage drew to Fernbridge, the harder that hope became to suppress, until by the final stretch of road, he found himself leaning forward in his seat, watching the horizon as though he might catch sight of her, simply by wanting it badly enough. Fernbridge appeared first, as a scatter of gray rooftops against the darker gray of the sea, smoke rising from chimneys into a sky heavy with the promise of more rain. Julian instructed his driver to stop at the edge of town, choosing to walk the final stretch himself, partly to avoid drawing attention with an unfamiliar carriage, and partly because a restless energy had built inside him that made sitting still feel unbearable. He walked down the narrow main street, past the harbor where fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings, past a row of shop fronts with hand-painted signs, until he reached the small bakery Clara Bennett had run for the better part of 2 decades. He had chosen the bakery almost at random, drawn by the warm smell of bread that reminded him, absurdly, of the kitchens at Ashcombe on baking days long past. He stepped inside, the small bell above the door announcing his arrival, and found himself face to face with a woman in her middle years, flour dusted across her apron, who looked him over with the sharp, assessing gaze of someone accustomed to sizing up strangers quickly. Julian offered a polite greeting and asked, as casually as he could manage, whether the woman might know of a seamstress in town skilled enough to repair a torn traveling coat. Clara's expression shifted almost imperceptibly at the question, a flicker of something that might have been caution crossing her features before settling back into practiced neutrality. She told him, after a brief pause, that there was indeed a fine seamstress in town, a widow who lived and worked not far from the harbor, and gave him careful directions to a small shop 2 streets over. Julian thanked her, careful to keep his voice steady despite the sudden pounding of his heart, and stepped back out into the gray afternoon light, following the directions with a growing sense that he stood on the edge of something he could not yet fully name. The shop, when he found it, was modest but well kept, its window display arranged with careful attention to draw the eye, bolts of fabric in muted, tasteful colors visible through the glass. A small bell chimed as Julian pushed open the door, and for a moment, the interior of the shop seemed empty, quiet, except for the soft ticking of a clock somewhere near the back. Then a voice called out from a back room, asking him to wait just a moment, a voice that struck Julian with such immediate, physical force that he had to grip the edge of the counter to keep himself steady. He knew that voice. 7 years had passed, 7 years of doubt and searching, and slowly fading hope, but he knew that voice as certainly as he knew his own name. Every rehearsed question he had planned to ask, every careful strategy for confirming the seamstress's identity without alarming her, evaporated instantly, replaced by a single, overwhelming need to see her face and confirm what his heart had already accepted as true. He stood frozen near the counter, unable to move, unable to speak, as footsteps approached from the back room, growing closer with each passing second. Evelina stepped through the doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth, already speaking an apology for the delay, and stopped mid-sentence the moment her eyes found the man standing near her counter. The cloth slipped from her fingers, forgotten, as color drained from her face, and then rushed back in a flush of shock so complete that for several long seconds, neither of them spoke at all. The shop around them seemed to fall away entirely, the ticking clock, the bolts of fabric, the gray light through the window, all of it dissolving into insignificance against the sheer impossibility of the two of them standing in the same small room after 7 years apart. Julian found his voice first, though it came out rougher and quieter than he intended, barely more than a whisper of her name. Evelina did not answer immediately. She stood absolutely still, one hand pressed flat against the counter, as though needing its solid presence to keep herself upright. Her eyes moving over his face with an expression that mixed disbelief, fear, and something achingly close to the affection Julian remembered from years before. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, asking how he had found her, though the question carried the weight of a dozen other questions she did not yet dare to ask aloud. The conversation that followed was halting and painful, both of them speaking in fragments, circling around the enormous space of 7 missing years, without either quite managing to step fully into it. Julian explained, briefly, the merchant at the horse auction, the careful journey to Fernbridge, the years of searching that had preceded it. Evelina, for her part, offered only cautious, guarded responses, her instinct for self-protection warring visibly with the part of her that still, after everything, wanted desperately to close the distance between them. Neither of them noticed, in those first overwhelming minutes, the small sound of footsteps approaching from the back room, light and quick, the footsteps of a child. Henry appeared in the doorway a moment later, drawn by curiosity at the unfamiliar voice in his mother's shop, a sketchbook still tucked under one arm, from whatever drawing he had been working on in the back room. He stopped just inside the doorway, studying the stranger with the same open, unguarded curiosity he brought to everything new, and Julian, turning at the sound of the boy's arrival, felt the entire world narrow down to a single, devastating point of focus. He looked at the boy's face, at the shape of his eyes, the particular warm brown flecked with gold, a color Julian had seen every single morning of his own life reflected back at him from a mirror, and understood, with a certainty that hit like a physical blow, exactly what he was looking at. For a long, suspended moment, no one in the small shop spoke at all. Evelina watched Julian's face transform, watched recognition dawn and then deepen into something far more complicated, grief and joy and fury, all tangled together in a single expression she had never seen him wear before. She wanted, desperately, to explain everything at once, to pour out 7 years of careful, protective silence in a single breath, but the words caught in her throat, tangled with the fear of his reaction, the fear of what discovery might mean for the careful, hidden life she had built for her son. Henry, sensing the sudden tension in the room without understanding its source, moved instinctively closer to his mother, tucking himself against her side in the way children do when they recognize that something important and possibly frightening is happening around them. Evelina wrapped an arm around him automatically, a gesture of comfort and protection, so natural it required no thought, and it was that gesture, more than anything spoken aloud, that seemed to finally break through Julian's stunned silence. He took a single step forward, then stopped himself, visibly forcing his expression into something calmer, gentler, aware suddenly that whatever storm of emotion churned inside him, frightening a child who had no understanding of the situation, would serve no one well. He crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Henry's eye level, and introduced himself with careful gentleness, offering his given name only, watching as Henry studied him with the frank, evaluating gaze children often turn on new adults in their lives. Henry, after a moment's consideration, offered a small, polite greeting in return, then looked up at his mother, as if seeking permission to continue the conversation, a habit of caution that told Julian, more clearly than any words could have, something about the careful, protective way this child had been raised. Evelina managed a strained smile for her son's benefit, telling him gently that the gentleman was an old acquaintance, an explanation that satisfied Henry's curiosity for the moment, though his sharp eyes continued flicking between the two adults with obvious interest. Julian straightened, his gaze returning to Evelina, and though his voice remained carefully controlled, the intensity behind his next words was unmistakable. He asked her, quietly but firmly, whether they might speak alone, somewhere private, once the shop had closed for the evening. It was not truly a question, though he phrased it as one, and Evelina understood immediately that refusal was no longer a possibility she could reasonably choose. 7 years of careful hiding had ended the moment Henry walked through that doorway, and no amount of caution now could undo what had already been seen and understood. She sent Henry to the back room to finish his sketch, promising him a treat from Clara's bakery once his work was done, a bribe he accepted eagerly, too young yet to fully grasp the significance of what had just occurred in the front of the shop. Once he had disappeared through the doorway, Evelina turned back to Julian, her composure fragile but holding, and asked him, in a voice barely above a whisper, how much he already understood. Julian's answer came without hesitation, his eyes never leaving hers, stating plainly that he understood enough to know he had a son he had never known existed, and that he intended to understand everything else before the night was through. The remaining hours of the afternoon passed, in a strange, suspended tension, both of them moving through the ordinary motions of closing the shop, sweeping fabric scraps, locking the front door, while in entire conversation, neither of them was ready to have hung unspoken between every small task. Clara, informed briefly and vaguely that Evelina had unexpected business to attend to that evening, offered to keep Henry at the bakery overnight, sensing without being told that whatever was unfolding required privacy that a curious 7-year-old could not be present for. Evelina accepted gratefully, kissing her son goodnight with a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the ordinary ache of temporary separation, and everything to do with the uncertainty of what the coming hours might bring. As darkness settled fully over Fernbridge, Evelina led Julian up the narrow staircase to the small rooms above her shop, rooms that held 7 years of careful, quiet survival, a life built entirely without him, a life he was now, for the first time, being allowed to see. She lit a single lamp against the growing dark, and the two of them stood facing each other across the small space, 7 years of separation, misunderstanding, and unspoken grief, finally, unavoidably, about to be confronted in full. Julian broke the silence first, his voice low and rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He asked her, simply, why? Why she had left without a word, without a letter, without giving him even the smallest chance to make things right, before she vanished from his life entirely. The question carried none of the anger Evelina had braced herself for, only a raw, aching confusion that seemed to have been building inside him for 7 long years, finally given room to surface now that the two of them stood face to face again. Evelina lowered herself onto the small wooden chair by the window, her hands twisting together in her lap as she searched for a place to begin a story she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind, but had never once spoken aloud. She started with the afternoon in the drawing room, describing the Duchess's calm, measured voice, the careful arguments about duty and bloodlines, and the ruin that scandal could bring down on a family that had survived centuries without a stain on its name. She watched Julian's expression harden with each detail, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists at his sides, though he said nothing, letting her continue. She told him about the money the Duchess had offered, about the coins that had felt heavier than any amount of gold should, about the quiet threat wrapped inside gentle words, the suggestion that if Evelina truly loved him, she would disappear before he returned from the northern estates. She admitted, her voice breaking slightly, that she had not known yet, in that exact moment, about the child growing inside her, but that the discovery had come only days later, cementing a decision she might otherwise have reconsidered once her fear had cooled. Julian listened without interrupting, though the effort of staying silent seemed to cost him visibly, his breathing growing sharper, his eyes darkening with a fury that Evelina understood, with relief, was not directed at her. When she finally finished, describing the long carriage ride to the coast and the frightened, determined resolve that had carried her through that first terrible night in Fernbridge, Julian remained quiet for a long moment, staring down at the floor as though trying to absorb the full weight of everything he had just heard. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter now, though no less intense. He told her that his mother had informed him only that Evelina had chosen to leave on her own, that she had grown tired of a life at Ashcombe, and decided a duke's world was not one she wished to remain part of. He had never believed it fully, not in his heart, but he had lacked any evidence to contradict it, and eventually, exhausted by years of fruitless searching, he had allowed himself to accept a version of events that offered at least some explanation, however unsatisfying, for her disappearance. Evelina felt a fresh wave of grief wash over her at the realization of how completely the Duchess's lie had shaped the years that followed, not only for her, but for Julian as well. She had imagined, during her loneliest nights in Fernbridge, that perhaps he had simply moved on, that perhaps the loss of her had cost him little beyond a brief inconvenience before he returned to the ordinary rhythms of his life. Seeing now the toll those years had clearly taken, the guardedness in his eyes, the weariness that had replaced the easy warmth she remembered, she understood that her absence had wounded him as deeply as his family's cruelty had wounded her. Julian rose from where he had been standing and crossed the small room to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that made Evelina's carefully maintained composure finally begin to crack. He told her, his voice thick with emotion, that he did not blame her for the choice she had made, that faced with the same threats and the same fear for a child not yet born, he could not honestly say he would have chosen differently. His anger, he said, belonged entirely to his mother, and to himself, for not standing firm enough, soon enough, to prevent his family from having the power to threaten her in the first place. The admission opened something in Evelina that she had kept tightly sealed for 7 years, and she found herself weeping openly for the first time since that first lonely night above Clara's bakery. 7 years of grief and fear, and careful, exhausting strength, finally allowed to break loose in the presence of the one person who had always made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. Julian gathered her hands more firmly in his own, saying nothing further, simply staying beside her as the weight of everything unspoken finally found its release. When her tears eventually slowed, Evelina found the courage to ask the question that had haunted her most persistently over the years, more than fear of discovery, more than the daily struggle of raising a child alone. She asked him whether he had, in the years since, found happiness with someone else, whether the life he had built in her absence included a family of his own that her sudden reappearance might now disrupt or complicate. Julian's answer came without hesitation, a quiet, firm no, followed by an explanation that he had spent 7 years unable to offer his heart fully to anyone, unable to shake the persistent, unresolved feeling that some essential part of his life remained unfinished. The conversation continued late into the night, the two of them slowly filling in the gaps of 7 separate years, Julian describing the investigator he had hired, the countless towns searched and abandoned, the moment at the horse auction when a merchant's idle comment had finally, improbably, set him on the correct path. Evelina described Henry's birth, the fierce, immediate love she had felt the moment she held him, the careful fiction she had constructed to explain his father's absence, a fiction that would now, inevitably, have to be unraveled and replaced with something far more complicated, but far more true. It was well past midnight when Julian finally raised the question that had been building beneath every other part of their conversation. the question of what came next. He told her plainly that he could not, and would not, simply return to Ashcombe and leave behind the son he had just discovered, regardless of what complications that decision might create for his family's reputation or his mother's carefully guarded sense of propriety. He wanted, he said, to be part of Henry's life, fully and openly, not as a distant benefactor sending money from afar, but as a father in every meaningful sense of the word. Evelina heard the sincerity in his voice, saw it reflected in the steady, unwavering way he held her gaze. But 7 years of hard-won independence made it impossible for her to simply surrender to the relief of his return, without at least voicing the fears that still lingered beneath the surface. She asked him carefully what such involvement would actually mean in practice, whether he intended to take Henry away from the only home and community he had ever known, whether the boy would be expected to leave behind Clara and Mrs. Dobbins, and the harbor he loved so dearly, to become a stranger in a grand manor house, among people who might never fully accept him. Julian did not have an immediate, polished answer for every one of her concerns, and Evelina found something reassuring in that honesty, in the fact that he did not try to smooth over the genuine complexity of the situation with easy promises he could not actually guarantee. He told her instead that he intended to figure out those answers together with her, not impose a solution unilaterally, the way his mother had once imposed her will, without any regard for Evelina's own voice in the matter. Whatever path forward existed, he said, it would be one they built jointly, as equal partners in Henry's life, regardless of the differences in their stations that had once been used as a weapon to tear them apart. The lamp had burned low by the time their conversation finally wound to a natural pause, both of them exhausted by the emotional weight of everything spoken and unspoken across those long hours. Julian rose reluctantly, aware that propriety demanded he seek lodging elsewhere for the night, rather than remaining in Evelina's small rooms, though every instinct in him resisted the idea of leaving her side again so soon after finally finding her. At the door, he paused, turning back to look at her one final time, and asked, quietly, whether he might return in the morning to properly meet his son, not as a stranger passing through, but as the father Henry deserved to finally know. Evelina agreed, her voice steady despite the exhaustion and emotion of the night, and watched from her window as Julian made his way back down the narrow street toward the small inn near the harbor where he had arranged lodging for his manservant earlier that day. She remained by the window long after he disappeared from sight, turning the silver ring on her finger slowly, allowing herself, for the first time in 7 years, to imagine a future that included Julian openly, without secrecy, without fear, though the practical complications of such a future still loomed uncertain and daunting ahead of her. She thought of Henry, sleeping soundly at Clara's, unaware that his entire understanding of his own family was about to be rewritten. She thought of the Duchess, and the reckoning that would inevitably follow once Julian returned to Ashcombe, with news of a grandson she had worked so deliberately to erase from existence. And she thought, finally, of herself, of the frightened young woman who had fled into the night 7 years earlier, and the far stronger woman who now stood ready to face whatever came next, not alone this time, but alongside the man who had never stopped searching for her, even when every reasonable voice around him had told him to give up. Morning arrived gray and windswept, the harbor waves choppier than usual as a storm gathered somewhere out over the open water, and Evelina woke early after only a few restless hours of sleep, her mind already turning over the enormous conversation that lay ahead. She dressed carefully, though not extravagantly, choosing a simple dress that felt honest to the life she had actually built, rather than any attempt to present herself as something grander than the seamstress she had genuinely become. She walked to Clara's bakery before opening her own shop, finding Henry already awake and full of energy, chattering happily about the treats Clara had promised him the evening before, entirely unaware of the significance of the day ahead. She sat him down at the small table near the bakery's back window, took a steadying breath, and began, as gently as she knew how, to explain that the man he had met the previous afternoon was not simply an old acquaintance, but someone far more important, someone connected to Henry, in a way his mother had never yet been able to explain fully. Henry listened with the wide-eyed seriousness children reserve, for moments they sense are important even before they fully understand why, and when Evelina finally spoke the words that the stranger from yesterday was, in fact, his father, the boy sat in stunned silence for a long moment, before a flood of questions came pouring out all at once. Evelina answered as many of his questions as she honestly could, explaining in careful, age-appropriate terms that circumstances beyond either parent's control had kept them apart, that Julian had not known Henry existed until the previous day, and that his absence had never once meant he did not love him, because how could anyone not love him once they knew he existed? Henry absorbed this information with the particular resilience children often show when given honesty, delivered with enough gentleness, his initial shock slowly settling into a cautious, curious anticipation about meeting this father figure properly, this time with full understanding of who he actually was. Julian arrived at the bakery just past mid-morning, dressed more simply than the previous day, but still carrying himself with the quiet, unmistakable bearing of a man accustomed to authority, and bearing that Clara noted with sharp interest even as she said nothing aloud. He greeted Evelina with a warmth that made her chest tighten pleasantly, despite the anxiety of the moment, then turned his full attention to Henry, crouching once again to bring himself to the boy's eye level, this time with the knowledge between them fully acknowledged rather than hidden beneath polite fiction. The conversation between father and son began haltingly, both of them navigating unfamiliar territory with careful, tentative steps. Julian asked Henry about his sketchbook, genuinely curious after glimpsing a page or two the previous day, and Henry, always eager to discuss his drawings, brightened immediately, pulling the well-worn book from beneath his arm to show off his careful renderings of the fishing boats in the harbor. Julian studied the drawings with real attention, praising specific details with genuine admiration, rather than the empty flattery adults sometimes offer children. And something in that authentic engagement seemed to ease Henry's remaining wariness considerably. By the time the morning had stretched into afternoon, the three of them had made their way down to the harbor together, Henry eagerly pointing out which boats belonged to which families, explaining with great authority the different types of fish each crew typically brought in, while Julian listened with an attentiveness that clearly delighted his son. Evelina walked slightly behind them, watching the easy rapport building between father and son, with an ache in her chest that mixed grief for the years already lost, with a fierce, grateful joy for the connection now finally being allowed to form. That evening, after Henry had been settled back at Clara's for another night, Julian and Evelina walked together along the harbor path, the storm that had threatened all day finally beginning to release its first scattered drops of rain. Julian spoke seriously about the practical matters that would need to be addressed in the coming weeks, matters he had clearly been considering carefully since the previous night. He intended, he explained, to formally acknowledge Henry as his son and heir, a declaration that would carry significant legal and social weight, ensuring that regardless of whatever objections his mother might raise, Henry's position and future security would be protected beyond any question. He acknowledged, honestly, that such a declaration would create considerable difficulty, that his mother would almost certainly fight the acknowledgement with every resource and connection at her disposal, and that the wider society of their county would likely respond with the same judgment and gossip Evelina had feared 7 years earlier. But he told her, firmly, that he no longer intended to allow fear of that judgment to dictate the shape of his family, a mistake he had already made once, at devastating cost, and one he refused to repeat, now that he finally understood the full truth of what had been taken from him. Evelina listened to his resolve with a complicated mixture of hope and lingering caution, the 7 years of hard-won independence making it difficult for her to simply hand over control of her son's future to decisions being made, however well-intentioned, without her full and equal voice in the process. She told him plainly that she needed him to understand something important, that she was no longer the frightened young woman who had fled Ashcombe in the dark, that whatever future they built together would need to be built as genuine partners, with her opinions and her son's well-being given equal weight to any consideration of title, legacy, or social standing. Julian received this with visible respect rather than defensiveness, telling her that he understood completely, that the very independence and strength she had built during their years apart was part of what made him certain, beyond any doubt, that she was exactly the woman he had always believed her to be, 7 years ago and now. The rain grew steadier as they walked, and neither of them moved to seek shelter, both content, for the moment, simply to remain in each other's company, after so many years of forced separation. Word of Julian's extended absence from Ashcombe had, by that point, reached the Duchess through his usual correspondence with the estate's steward, and though Julian had been deliberately vague about the exact nature of his business along the coast, the Duchess possessed a sharp enough instinct to grow immediately suspicious. She recalled, with a flicker of old unease she had spent 7 years successfully suppressing, the young seamstress she had sent away, and the northern investigation Julian had eventually, mercifully in her mind, allowed to quietly fade. A prolonged, unexplained absence to the coastal counties felt, to her calculating mind, like far too significant a coincidence to ignore. She dispatched a letter to Julian immediately, phrased with careful concern for his well-being, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of demand that he explain himself and return to his duties at Ashcombe without further delay. The letter reached Julian on the 4th day of his stay in Fernbridge, and he read it standing in the small parlor of his rented rooms at the Harbour Inn, his jaw tightening with each carefully worded line. He recognized immediately the same controlling instinct that had once cost him 7 years of his life, and rather than respond with the careful diplomacy he might once have offered, he wrote back with unflinching directness, informing his mother plainly that he had found Evelina, that he had a son, and that both would soon be returning with him to Ashcombe, as acknowledged members of his family. The response from Ashcombe arrived with startling speed, delivered not by letter this time, but by the Duchess herself, who had apparently set out for the coast within hours of receiving Julian's declaration, unwilling to trust such a critical matter to correspondence alone. She arrived in Fernbridge on the 6th day, her fine carriage drawing immediate and curious attention from a town unaccustomed to such visible displays of wealth, and made her way directly to the Harbour Inn, where her son had been staying, her expression set in the same calm, controlled mask she had worn 7 years earlier, in that fateful drawing-room conversation. Julian met his mother in the inn's small private parlor, and the conversation that followed carried none of the careful diplomacy either of them might once have offered each other. He confronted her directly with what he now knew, describing plainly the threats and manipulation Evelina had described to him, watching his mother's composed expression flicker briefly, before settling back into practiced calm. She did not deny the substance of what he accused her of, though she framed her actions, as she always had, as necessary protection of the family's legacy rather than cruelty inflicted on an innocent young woman, and, unknowingly at the time, an unborn grandchild. The argument that followed was the sharpest and most direct disagreement Julian had ever allowed himself with his mother. 7 years of suppressed grief and anger, finally given full voice. He told her plainly that her actions had cost him 7 years with the woman he loved, and 7 years of his son's life that could never be recovered, a cost he was no longer willing to simply forgive and set aside for the sake of family harmony. He informed her, with a firmness that clearly startled her, that his decision to acknowledge Henry publicly was not open for negotiation, and that if she wished to remain a meaningful part of her grandson's life going forward, she would need to demonstrate genuine remorse, rather than continued justification for what she had done. The Duchess, faced for the first time with a version of her son unwilling to be managed or persuaded away from his chosen course, found herself in unfamiliar territory. She had spent decades accustomed to Julian's deference, to his careful consideration of her opinions on every significant matter affecting the family, and the sudden, immovable resolve now facing her left her uncertain how to proceed. She requested, finally, quietly, the chance to meet the boy herself, and request Julian considered carefully before agreeing to, on the strict condition that Evelina be present throughout, and that no attempt be made to influence or manipulate the situation, without her full knowledge and consent. The meeting took place the following afternoon, in the small parlor of Evelina's shop, tension thick in the air, as the Duchess entered a space so different from the grand halls of Ashcombe, her sharp eyes taking in the modest but carefully maintained surroundings, with an expression Evelina could not quite read. Henry, sensing the significance of the occasion from the careful, serious way his parents had explained it to him that morning, stood a little straighter than usual, his sketchbook left behind at Evelina's insistence, wanting this meeting to be about the boy himself, rather than any display of his talents. The Duchess studied her grandson for a long, silent moment, and something in her carefully composed expression shifted almost imperceptibly as she took in the unmistakable resemblance to her own son at that same young age, the same eyes, the same particular tilt of the chin when considering something seriously. Whatever calculations had driven her decisions 7 years earlier seemed, for just a moment, to waver in the face of an undeniable, living connection to her own family line standing directly in front of her. She said little during that first meeting, offering only careful, measured pleasantries, but Evelina noted, with cautious surprise, that the woman's eyes remained fixed on Henry throughout the entire visit, following his every movement, with an intensity that suggested far more internal conflict than her composed exterior revealed. The days following the Duchess's visit fell into a fragile, uncertain rhythm. She did not return to Ashcombe immediately, choosing instead to take rooms at the same Harbour Inn where Julian was staying, insisting she wished to spend more time coming to understand her grandson properly, before any final decisions were made about the family's future arrangements. Julian remained wary of her motives, though he allowed the visits to continue, believing, perhaps too generously, that genuine time spent with Henry might soften whatever calculating instincts still lingered beneath his mother's careful composure. What neither Julian nor Evelina knew was that the Duchess had not traveled to the coast entirely alone in her thinking. Before leaving Ashcombe, she had summoned her longtime family solicitor, a sharp, ambitious man named Mr. Aldous Pemberton, and instructed him, in careful, deliberately vague terms, to explore what legal avenues might exist to ensure the family's interests remained protected, regardless of how the situation in Fernbridge ultimately resolved. Pemberton, eager to please a woman whose favor had shaped his entire career, interpreted her instructions with far more aggressive intent than she had perhaps consciously intended, and began quietly investigating the legal standing of a child born outside marriage to a woman with no recorded noble lineage of her own. Pemberton discovered, through careful research into old family law, an obscure but technically valid precedent, suggesting that a duke's illegitimate child could, under certain specific circumstances, be formally removed from a mother deemed unable to provide an upbringing suitable to the family's station, particularly if that mother could not demonstrate stable, respectable circumstances beyond reasonable challenge. It was a harsh, rarely invoked provision, one most families avoided using, precisely because of the public scandal it inevitably generated. But Pemberton, convinced he was acting in the family's ultimate interest, began quietly preparing the legal groundwork necessary to invoke it, all without informing Julian directly of his activities. He arrived in Fernbridge on a gray, blustery morning, 9 days after the Duchess's initial arrival, presenting himself not to Julian, but directly to local magistrates, carrying documentation designed to establish, on paper at least, sufficient grounds for an emergency custody intervention. His plan relied on speed and surprise, believing that if he could secure a preliminary magistrate's order before Julian became aware of his actions, the matter could be presented to the Duke as an unfortunate but legally necessary formality, rather than an act of open defiance against his explicit wishes. Clara was the first to notice something amiss, watching from the bakery window as an unfamiliar, sharply dressed man spent an unusual amount of time in quiet conversation with the town's senior magistrate, a conversation that seemed to involve considerable passing of documents and low, serious tones, entirely unlike the town's usual unhurried business. Her instincts, honed by years of reading the moods and motivations of strangers passing through Fernbridge, told her something concerning was unfolding, and she made her way immediately to Evelina's shop to share her unease. Evelina's blood ran cold at Clara's description of the visitor, recognizing immediately from the careful way Clara described his bearing and manner of dress, that this was almost certainly someone connected to Ashcombe, someone acting with purpose she could not yet fully understand, but instinctively feared. She sent word immediately to the Harbour Inn, asking Julian to come to her shop as quickly as possible, and spent the agonizing minutes waiting for his arrival trying to keep her rising panic from showing in front of Henry, who sat nearby working on a new sketch, blessedly unaware of the danger potentially closing in around him. Julian arrived within minutes, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as Evelina relayed what Clara had witnessed, and the two of them made their way immediately to the magistrate's office, arriving just as Pemberton was finalizing the paperwork for what he had framed as a preliminary protective order, a legal mechanism that, once signed, would authorize local officials to remove Henry temporarily into designated custody, pending a formal hearing regarding his long-term guardianship arrangements. The magistrate, an elderly man more accustomed to settling disputes over fishing rights and property boundaries than navigating the complex legal territory of noble family law, had been visibly swayed by Pemberton's confident presentation and impressive documentation. Julian's arrival changed the situation immediately and dramatically, his identity as the actual Duke of Ashcombe carrying weight that Pemberton's borrowed authority could not match. He confronted his mother's solicitor directly, his fury barely contained beneath a surface of icy control, demanding to know under whose explicit authority Pemberton had traveled to Fernbridge to pursue such drastic action against a child Julian had already publicly declared his intention to acknowledge as his own son and heir. Pemberton, visibly rattled by the unexpected confrontation with the very man whose interests he believed himself to be protecting, stammered an explanation involving the Duchess's earlier instructions, though he could offer no evidence that she had explicitly authorized this specific, extreme course of action. The magistrate, now thoroughly confused by the sudden collision of conflicting authorities within his small office, wisely suspended any further action on the paperwork until the matter could be clarified, a decision that bought precious time, but did nothing to fully resolve the danger, since the legal groundwork Pemberton had prepared remained technically valid and could potentially be revived through official channels if the underlying dispute within the family was not decisively settled. Julian left the magistrate's office with his jaw tight and his mind already turning toward the confrontation with his mother that could no longer be delayed or avoided. He found her in the private parlor of the Harbor Inn, and the conversation that followed was unlike any disagreement they had ever had before, stripped entirely of the careful diplomatic restraint that had governed their previous conflicts. Julian demanded to know whether she had explicitly authorized Pemberton's actions, or whether the solicitor had acted on his own dangerous initiative, and the Duchess, for the first time in the entire ordeal, appeared genuinely shaken, insisting with what seemed like real sincerity that she had only asked Pemberton to research the family's legal position, never to actually pursue removal of the child without her direct, explicit approval. Whether her claim was entirely truthful, or a convenient reframing after the fact, Julian could not be certain, and the uncertainty itself struck him as a devastating verdict on the state of trust between them after everything that had already been broken and only partially repaired. He told her, with a coldness that clearly wounded her more than any earlier anger had managed to, that regardless of the precise details of what she had or had not authorized, her continued willingness to explore any avenue for controlling or removing Henry from his mother's care represented exactly the kind of cruelty that had already cost their family 7 irreplaceable years, and that he would not allow it to continue for even a single day longer. He informed her, with a finality that left no room for further negotiation, that he intended to formalize Henry's legal status as his acknowledged heir immediately, through the most binding and public legal channels available, specifically, to remove any future possibility of the kind of manipulation Pemberton had just attempted. He further informed her that Evelina's role in Henry's life would be protected and honored fully and permanently, regardless of whether she and the Duchess ever reached genuine reconciliation, and that any further attempt to threaten or undermine that arrangement would result in a complete and permanent separation between his mother and the family she claimed to be protecting. The Duchess, faced with the very real possibility of losing all future relationship with her only grandson through her own continued rigidity, finally allowed the careful composure she had maintained for 7 years to crack entirely. She wept, for what Julian realized was perhaps the first time he had ever witnessed in his adult life, admitting through her tears that her actions, however wrongly executed, had been rooted in a genuine, if badly misguided, fear of losing her son to scandal and her family's legacy to ruin, fears that had blinded her to the far greater cost of the cruelty those actions had actually inflicted. It was not, Julian understood, a complete or instant transformation, and he remained wary of trusting his mother's remorse too quickly, given how thoroughly she had once deceived him. But something in the raw, unguarded nature of her tears that afternoon suggested a genuine reckoning had finally begun, a recognition that the family legacy she had spent her life protecting meant nothing if it came at the cost of the family itself. He left her that afternoon without offering full forgiveness, but with a cautious willingness to allow the possibility of repair, provided her future actions demonstrated the sincerity her words now claimed. Evelina, informed of the full confrontation once Julian returned to her shop that evening, listened with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease. The danger had passed, at least for now, but the incident had underscored precisely the fears she had voiced days earlier about the vulnerability of building a life within a family capable of wielding such power against her and her son. Julian, sensing her continued wariness, took her hands firmly in his own and repeated the promise he had made days before, that whatever protections needed to be built, legal or otherwise, to ensure Henry's safety and her own standing, could never again be threatened by anyone within his family. He intended to build them without delay or compromise. That night, once Henry had been safely tucked into bed and Evelina had checked on him twice more than usual before finally allowing herself to rest, she lay awake, turning over the events of the day. The sheer terror of nearly losing her son to a stranger's legal maneuvering still fresh and raw in her chest. She thought of the 7 years of careful hiding, the constant vigilance, the precautions taken every time a wealthy stranger passed through Fernbridge, and understood now, with painful clarity, that those instincts had not been paranoid overcaution, but genuinely justified fear. Fear that had very nearly proven correct, even after Julian's return had seemed to promise safety and reconciliation. Whatever future lay ahead, she resolved firmly, it would need to be built on protections far stronger than good intentions and quiet promises alone. In the days that followed the confrontation with Pemberton and the raw, unguarded conversation with his mother, Julian moved with a new sense of urgency, determined to convert his promises into concrete, unshakable protections before any further threat could take root. He arranged for his own trusted solicitor, a careful and fiercely loyal man named Edmund Farrow, who had served the Ashcombe family for over 2 decades, to travel to Fernbridge immediately, bypassing Pemberton entirely, and ensuring that whatever legal arrangements were drawn up would answer only to Julian's explicit wishes, rather than any lingering influence from his mother's camp. Farrow arrived within a week, and the process of formally acknowledging Henry as Julian's legitimate heir began in earnest, a process considerably more complex than either Julian or Evelina had initially anticipated. Formal acknowledgement required documentation, witness declarations, and careful navigation of inheritance law that had never been designed with quite this situation in mind. Farrow worked methodically, explaining each step patiently to Evelina, who insisted on understanding every detail of the arrangements being made, rather than simply trusting the process to unfold around her, without her full participation. One of the central questions Farrow raised, delicately but directly, concerned the nature of Julian and Evelina's future relationship, since Henry's full legal standing as heir would be considerably more secure and less vulnerable to future legal challenge if his parents were formally married, rather than remaining in the more legally ambiguous position of an acknowledged but unmarried arrangement. The question hung in the air between Julian and Evelina during that particular meeting, with a weight neither of them had quite anticipated having to address so directly, so soon after everything else that had already unfolded. That evening, once Farrow had returned to his rooms at the inn, and Henry had been settled for the night, Julian raised the subject again, this time without the formal presence of a solicitor, choosing instead the quiet privacy of the small parlor above Evelina's shop where so much of their reunion had already unfolded. He told her, with a directness that carried none of the practiced formality he had once planned for a proposal delivered years earlier, that marriage between them was not simply a legal convenience for Henry's protection, though it certainly served that purpose, but something he had wanted, in his heart, every single day of the 7 years they had spent apart. Evelina listened carefully, her expression difficult to read, and when she finally spoke, she did not offer an immediate answer, choosing instead to voice the fears that still lingered beneath her hope. She told him she needed to know, with complete honesty, that any marriage between them would be built on equal partnership rather than obligation, that she would not simply be absorbed quietly into the machinery of Ashcombe as a convenient solution to a legal complication, expected to fade into the background while the family's public image was carefully managed around her. Julian answered her with equal honesty, acknowledging that he could not promise the transition would be simple or free of difficulty, that his mother's remaining influence and the judgment of wider society would likely present real challenges in the months and years ahead. But he promised her, with a conviction that left no room for doubt, that whatever challenges arose, they would face them as true partners, her voice carrying equal weight in every decision affecting their family, exactly as she had insisted upon from their very first conversation after his arrival in Fernbridge. It was Henry, in his own unknowing way, who ultimately helped settle the lingering uncertainty between his parents. A few days later, while the three of them walked together along the harbor path, he asked, with the blunt curiosity children often bring to complicated adult matters, whether his mother and father intended to get married, since in his understanding, That was simply what parents who loved each other were supposed to do. Both Julian and Evelina found themselves laughing, genuinely and freely, for the first time in what felt like ages, the simple clarity of a child's perspective cutting cleanly through the tangled complications the adults had been wrestling with for days. The wedding, when it finally took place, was deliberately modest in scale, held in the small stone church at the edge of Fernbridge, rather than the grand cathedral setting that a duke's marriage might traditionally have commanded. Julian insisted on this choice himself, wanting the ceremony to honor the community that had protected and sustained Evelina and Henry through their 7 years of quiet exile, rather than erasing that community's role in favor of a more socially prestigious setting. Clara stood proudly among the small gathering of guests, tears streaming freely down her face throughout the entire ceremony, while Mrs. Dobbins, her eyesight nearly gone but her spirit undimmed, sat near the front with Henry seated beside her, watching his parents with an expression of solemn, delighted importance. The Duchess attended as well, seated toward the back of the small church, her presence marking the first tentative step in what would prove to be a long, gradual process of rebuilding trust that could never be fully restored to what it might have been without her earlier interference, but which had, at least, begun to move in a direction of genuine reconciliation rather than continued conflict. She did not speak during the ceremony, but Evelina noticed, glancing back once during the exchange of vows, that the older woman's carefully composed expression had finally, visibly softened into something that looked, unmistakably, like quiet regret mixed with cautious hope for whatever future still remained possible to build. In the weeks following the wedding, the practical work of transitioning Evelina and Henry's life from Fernbridge to Ashcombe began in earnest, a process Julian was careful to handle with far more sensitivity than his family had once shown toward Evelina's needs and wishes. Rather than demanding an immediate, complete relocation, he arranged for the family to divide their time initially between Ashcombe and Fernbridge, allowing Henry to maintain his connections to Clara, Mrs. Dobbins, and the harbor community that had shaped his entire childhood, while gradually introducing him to the very different world he would eventually need to navigate as a future duke. Evelina, for her part, insisted on maintaining her seamstress work even after the move, not out of financial necessity, but because the craft had become something essential to her own sense of identity and independence, a connection to the strength she had built during the years she had survived entirely on her own resources and skill. Julian supported this decision fully, understanding that whatever adjustments their new life required, preserving Evelina's sense of self was not a luxury to be negotiated away, but a fundamental condition of the equal partnership he had promised her from the very beginning of their reunion. The wider society surrounding Ashcombe did not universally embrace the sudden arrival of a duke's previously unknown son and a wife whose background diverged so sharply from the noble lineages typically expected in such marriages. Whispers followed the family through their early public appearances, and more than a few prominent households declined invitations or offered only cool, distant courtesy when circumstances required interaction. But Julian met each instance of judgment with the same firm, unwavering resolve he had shown his mother, making clear through his own public conduct that any relationship with the Ashcombe family required genuine respect for his wife and son, without exception or compromise. Slowly, over the following months, that resolve began to shift the prevailing social winds, as families who valued their connection to the Duke found themselves gradually adjusting their attitudes to accommodate his clearly stated expectations. It was not a swift or complete transformation, and Evelina understood that certain corners of society would likely never fully accept her, but she found, to her quiet satisfaction, that she needed far less of that acceptance than she might once have imagined, secure, as she now was, in the genuine love of her husband, the joy of her son, and the hard-won knowledge of her own considerable strength. Henry adjusted to his new circumstances with the remarkable flexibility children often possess, though he never lost the particular warmth and unguarded curiosity that had endeared him to the entire community of Fernbridge, qualities that, to Julian's quiet delight, began to soften some of the more rigid formalities of life at Ashcombe, simply through the boy's natural, unaffected presence. He continued sketching constantly, his subjects gradually expanding from fishing boats to include the grand architecture and sprawling gardens of his new home, and Julian arranged for a proper tutor in drawing, once it became clear that his son's talent extended well beyond ordinary childhood hobby into something worth genuinely nurturing. As the first year of their new life together drew toward its close, Evelina found herself, on quiet evenings, standing at the window of what was now her own bedroom at Ashcombe Manor, looking out over gardens she had once believed she would never see again, wearing on her hand not the simple silver ring Julian had given her beneath the old oak tree so many years before, but a finer one that had joined it, a symbol of promises finally kept after 7 long years of separation, fear, and hard-earned resilience. The past could not be entirely undone, the years lost could never be fully recovered, but the future stretching ahead of her now felt, for the first time since that terrified night she had fled into the darkness, genuinely, solidly secure. 2 years passed before Julian finally organized the formal public event he had promised his mother years earlier would eventually come, a grand gathering at Ashcombe, intended not merely as another social occasion, but as a decisive public statement, presenting Henry to the full breadth of county society, as the acknowledged heir to the dukedom, standing openly and proudly beside his mother and father, with no shadow of secrecy or shame attached to his name. The event had been carefully planned, though Julian insisted throughout the preparations that its purpose was celebration rather than mere political maneuvering, a distinction he wanted Henry, now old enough to understand far more of the complicated history surrounding his own birth, to fully grasp. In the months leading up to the gathering, the Duchess had continued the slow, uneven process of rebuilding trust with both Julian and Evelina, a process marked by genuine effort, but also occasional relapses into old habits of control and judgment that required patient, sometimes difficult conversations to address. She had grown, undeniably, closer to Henry during this time, spending increasing amounts of time with her grandson, teaching him, somewhat to Evelina's surprise, the intricate history of the Ashcombe family, with a warmth and enthusiasm that suggested genuine affection rather than mere dutiful obligation. Evelina, for her part, had found unexpected common ground with the Duchess over their shared fierce protectiveness toward Henry, even as the two women remained, in many respects, quite different in temperament and outlook. Their relationship would likely never become one of easy warmth, given the depth of what had once passed between them, but a working respect had gradually developed, built on the Duchess's evident and growing remorse, and Evelina's own cautious willingness to allow that remorse room to prove itself genuine over time, rather than demanding instant, complete forgiveness. The night of the grand gathering arrived clear and cold, the manor's windows blazing with light that could be seen from miles along the county roads, carriages arriving in a steady stream throughout the early evening, bearing nearly every prominent family within traveling distance. Evelina, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that she had, with quiet pride, designed and stitched herself, stood beside Julian at the top of the grand staircase as guests were announced, her hand steady in his, despite the considerable nerves she felt at facing such a concentrated gathering of the society that had once so thoroughly rejected her. Henry, now 9 years old and considerably more composed than the curious, sketchbook-carrying boy who had first met his father in a small coastal shop, stood on Julian's other side, dressed in a fine coat that still could not quite disguise the restless energy that remained fundamentally part of his character. He greeted the arriving guests with a natural, easy charm that drew admiring comments throughout the evening, his manner striking exactly the right balance between the formal courtesy expected of a duke's heir and the genuine warmth that had always been his most distinctive quality. Julian took the opportunity, partway through the evening, to address the assembled gathering directly, standing before the crowded ballroom, with Evelina and Henry beside him, and spoke plainly and without apology about the circumstances that had once separated his family, circumstances rooted in fear and misguided judgment, rather than any failing on Evelina's part. He spoke of her strength in raising their son alone for 7 years, under difficult circumstances, of the life she had built through her own skill and determination, and declared, to a room that fell increasingly silent as he spoke, that he considered her not merely his wife, but the truest measure of character and resilience he had ever encountered in his life. The speech, delivered with an authenticity that startled many in attendance who had expected only the usual careful diplomatic phrases, typical of such formal occasions, shifted the mood of the entire evening in a way Julian had perhaps not fully anticipated. Several of the more influential families present, who had arrived with lingering reservations about the unconventional circumstances of the Duke's marriage, found themselves genuinely moved by the honesty of his words, and the careful, guarded courtesy that had characterized Evelina's early interactions with county society throughout the evening began, gradually, to warm into something more genuine as the night wore on. Near the end of the evening, the Duchess herself rose to speak briefly, an unplanned addition to the program that visibly surprised Julian, who had not requested or expected any remarks from his mother. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with evident effort, acknowledging before the assembled guests that her own past actions had caused genuine harm to her son and to the woman who now stood proudly as his wife, and expressing gratitude, with what appeared to be real emotion, for the grace both had extended in allowing her the chance to become part of her grandson's life, despite everything she had once done to prevent it. It was not a complete or perfect apology, but it was public, and it was sincere, and Evelina, watching from beside her husband, felt something in her chest that had remained tightly guarded for years finally begin to ease. The gathering continued late into the night, and by its end, Evelina understood that the careful, guarded existence she had maintained for so long, first in fear during her years in Fernbridge, and later in cautious hope during her early months at Ashcombe, had finally given way to something she had genuinely believed. For a long stretch of those 7 difficult years, she might never experience again. She belonged, fully and without qualification, not merely tolerated within the walls of Ashcombe Manor, but genuinely valued. Her strength and character recognized rather than dismissed. Her son secure, in a future that no longer depended on anyone's changeable goodwill, but stood protected by law, by love, and by the hard-won respect of the very family that had once tried to erase him before he was even born. In the quiet hours after the last guests had departed, Julian and Evelina stood together on the balcony, overlooking the gardens where they had first fallen in love so many years before. Henry finally asleep after the excitement of the evening, the manor settling into peaceful silence around them. Evelina rested her head against Julian's shoulder, thinking back over the long, difficult road that had brought them to this exact moment. The frightened flight into the darkness, the lonely years of quiet survival in a small coastal town, the terror of Pemberton's attempted intervention, and finally, this hard-won peace that felt, after everything, entirely and permanently earned. Julian pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head and told her softly that whatever years still lay ahead of them, however many challenges society or family or simple circumstance might yet present, he intended to face every one of them exactly as he should have faced the very first challenge 7 years earlier, standing firmly and openly beside her, refusing ever again to allow fear or family pressure to threaten what they had built together. Evelina, looking out over the moonlit gardens with her husband's arms wrapped securely around her, and her son sleeping safely inside the walls of a home that had finally, truly become theirs, allowed herself, at last, to fully believe him.